He was waiting for the bus like any ordinary Tuesday when a woman he had never seen before stepped beside him and quietly spoke his name. She didn't introduce herself or hesitate, just delivered a single sentence that froze him in place. His wife had been visiting a motel every Tuesday afternoon. Her voice was calm, almost too calm, as she described the routine with unsettling precision, down to the exact time his wife arrived and how long she stayed. He tried to dismiss it as a mistake or a cruel joke, but the certainty in her eyes made his stomach twist. The woman walked away before he could ask anything more, leaving him alone with a truth he wasn't ready to believe. As the bus rolled past without him, he realized his life had shifted in a single moment, and the only thing left to do was find out whether the stranger's warning was real. He spent the next week in a fog of dread, replaying every detail of the stranger's warning and wondering if he had missed signs that were obvious to everyone but him. When Tuesday finally came, he left work early under the pretense of a meeting and drove to the edge of town, heart hammering as he approached the Riverside Motel. It wasn't the kind of place anyone would mistake for respectable. The paint peeled, the neon sign flickered, and the parking lot was half filled with cars that looked like they hadn't moved in years. He parked far enough away that his wife wouldn't notice him, then lowered the seat and watched the entrance through a pair of old binoculars he had found in the garage. At exactly 3:17 p.m., just as the stranger had said, her car pulled in. She stepped out wearing clothes he had never seen before, casual but almost styled, like she had dressed for someone who wasn't him. She didn't pause or hesitate. She walked straight into room 204 as if she had done it 100 times. His breath hitched, but he forced himself to stay still, to observe, to gather whatever truth waited behind that door. Only minutes later, a man he had never seen before arrived, glanced around, and slipped into the same room. The husband raised his phone with shaking hands and took the first photograph. 10 minutes passed before the door opened again and the man left, head down, moving quickly toward his car. The husband barely had time to process it before another man appeared, this one younger, wearing a hoodie and carrying a backpack. He entered room 204 without knocking. Again, the husband took photos, documenting the time, angle, and license plate. His stomach churned, but he kept going, driven by something cold and mechanical inside him. Over the next 2 hours, 4 more men arrived, each entering the room as though it were routine. Some stayed only minutes, others longer, none acting surprised to find someone already inside. At one point, he nearly stepped out of his car, ready to storm across the parking lot and rip the door open, but something held him back. Maybe it was fear of the truth, or maybe it was the bitter instinct that whatever was happening was worse than a simple affair. He continued photographing everything. Faces, cars, the door to room 204, even the motel's cracked sign in case he would need evidence later. By the time the sun began to set, he felt numb, disconnected from his own body, as though he were watching someone else's life fall apart. Finally, when his wife emerged alone, fixing her hair and glancing at her reflection in the window, he captured one last photo before she drove away. He stayed in his car long after she was gone, staring at the door she had walked through, knowing nothing in his world would ever feel familiar again. What he had witnessed wasn't just betrayal. It was something coordinated, deliberate, and horrifyingly casual. And the worst part was the quiet certainty that this was only the beginning of what he would uncover. He didn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of the 6 men entering room 204, each one tightening the knot in his chest. By morning, his shock had hardened into determination. He needed to find the woman who had warned him, the one who knew far more than she should. He returned to the same bus stop at the same hour, standing exactly where she had stood, scanning every passerby. For a long time, nothing happened. Just commuters, school kids, and the normal rhythm of an unremarkable morning. Then, as the clock struck 9, he saw her, a petite woman with sharp eyes and a worn tote bag, watching him with a mixture of recognition and hesitation. She approached slowly, as though measuring whether he was ready for whatever truth she carried. He didn't wait. He stepped toward her, demanding to know why she had told him, how she had found out, and what exactly she knew. Instead of answering immediately, she motioned for him to walk with her toward a quieter side street. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was low and steady, the voice of someone who had rehearsed every word. She introduced herself as Denise. The name meant nothing until she added that she was the wife of the sixth man who had entered room 204. In that moment, the husband felt an unexpected jolt, not relief, not comfort, but the eerie realization that she, too, was living inside the same nightmare. Denise explained that she had followed Mitchell, her husband, for weeks after noticing changes in his behavior. The sudden secretive texting, the odd Tuesday appointments, the unexplained bank withdrawals. She hadn't wanted to believe he was cheating, so she collected evidence quietly, hoping she was wrong. But the more she watched him, the more the pattern solidified. Every Tuesday, he drove to Riverside Motel at nearly the same time. Every Tuesday, he entered room 204. And every Tuesday, he left with the same strange, dazed expression, like someone who had lived an entirely different life in the span of an hour. Denise revealed that she had already photographed the other men, noted their arrival times, and even recorded several license plates. She had been watching long before the husband ever suspected anything. What she hadn't expected was to discover another spouse caught in the same web. When she realized his wife matched the timing and description of one of the participants, she made the difficult decision to warn him directly. Her voice cracked when she explained that she didn't want him blindsided the way she had been. The husband felt a complicated blend of gratitude and dread. The puzzle was beginning to take shape, but the picture it revealed was darker than anything he could have imagined. He asked Denise why she hadn't confronted her own husband, and her answer chilled him. She said she feared the truth was bigger than an affair, something organized, something rehearsed, something ritualistic. Something she didn't understand. The husband realized then that they were no longer just two betrayed spouses. They were witnesses to something layered and secretive, something they had only begun to uncover. And neither of them had any idea just how deep the story in room 204 truly went. He spent the following Tuesday preparing himself in ways he had never imagined a week earlier. He took the day off work, packed a small bag with a recorder, a notepad, and a cheap prepaid phone, and drove to the Riverside Motel hours before anyone usually arrived. His hands trembled slightly as he walked into the lobby to rent a room, pretending to be a traveler passing through. The clerk barely looked at him, simply handed over a key attached to a faded plastic tag. Room 203. Directly beside 204. When he stepped inside, the room smelled faintly of bleach and old air conditioning, the curtains stiff with dust, the carpet worn thin. He locked the door behind him and sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the silence that felt like it was holding its breath. He placed his ear against the shared wall, testing how much sound traveled between the rooms. Even the faint hum of the next room's air vent seeped through, which meant voices surely would. He set up the recorder near the wall, angled for maximum clarity, then sat in the dark waiting for the first sign of movement. Time crawled painfully until, at exactly 3:18 p.m., a door slammed outside and footsteps approached the adjacent room. He recognized the rhythm of the steps instantly. It was his wife. Her voice floated through the wall, light and cheerful in a way she no longer sounded around him. Moments later, another pair of footsteps arrived, heavier and hurried. Then another. And another. He clenched his jaw as greetings were exchanged next door, but then something shifted. The casual murmurs transformed into structured conversation, almost theatrical, like an opening scene of a play. A man introduced himself in a booming voice as Thalorin, Paladin of the Crimson Fortress. Another responded in a raspy whisper, calling himself Merrick the Unseen. His wife's voice rose above the rest, clear and authoritative, explaining that she would be narrating their journey through a dungeon filled with traps, magic, and collaborative challenges. Her tone was practiced, commanding, nothing like the soft, hesitant voice she used at home. Dice clattered against a table. Laughter erupted. Then, without warning, the dialogue shifted again, growing intimate, suggestive, and strangely intertwined with the fantasy storyline. Characters spoke about uniting their powers, about ritual bonds, about strength shared through flesh and will. The husband's breath caught as he realized they were blending the Dungeons and Dragons narrative with physical acts, turning the entire session into a bizarre fusion of role play and group intimacy. He pressed his ear harder against the wall, forcing himself to hear every word even as it tore into him. His wife gave instructions, guided the quest, and the men responded with a mix of in-character dialogue and unmistakable physical involvement. The recorder captured everything: the laughter, the moans, the dice rolls, the shifting of chairs, the rustling of sheets, the sound of hands slapping against skin. At one point, one of the men asked her if the dungeon master would bless them for succeeding in a challenge. She answered with a low, commanding whisper that made his stomach twist. "Only if you obey." Hours passed before the noise finally settled into exhausted murmurs and scattered conversation. He sat frozen, unable to move, barely able to breathe, as the truth crystallized in his mind. This wasn't a random affair. This wasn't a spontaneous group of thrill seekers. This was a coordinated ritual, crafted and rehearsed, performed under the guise of fantasy gaming. His wife wasn't just a participant, she was the leader. When the last person left room 204, he quietly gathered the recorder, filled several pages with notes, and took pictures of every timestamp. He walked out of the motel with the evidence in his pocket and a hollow pit inside his chest. The marriage was already over. Now he simply needed to prove it to the world. He confronted her the next morning, choosing a moment when the house was quiet and she was distracted by her phone. He placed the printed photos on the kitchen table one by one, each image a piece of truth she could no longer escape. At first, she stared without expression, as though they were pictures of strangers, not of her walking into a motel room with 6 different men. Then she looked up at him with a kind of irritated confusion, as if he were interrupting something trivial. Instead of apologizing, she rolled her eyes and asked why he had been spying on her. His anger surged, but he forced himself to stay composed, explaining what he had seen and heard, how he had recorded everything, how he knew every detail. Her reaction was so surreal it left him speechless. She shrugged and said he had no right to judge her creative life. When he demanded to know how she could justify any of it, she claimed he had become boring, predictable, and uninspired, and that her adventures were a necessary escape. It stunned him how casually she dismissed the betrayal, describing the group as collaborative partners in both fantasy storytelling and physical exploration. When he told her he was filing for divorce, she smirked like she had expected it and pulled out a handwritten list of demands. The demands were absurd. She wanted the house, the car, half his retirement account, and even his grandmother's jewelry that she had never cared about. She insisted that her emotional labor over the years entitled her to more than half of everything. He felt dizzy listening to her, realizing she had rehearsed this moment the same way she rehearsed the fantasy scenarios in room 204. When he refused, she raised her voice, accusing him of lacking imagination, accusing him of not being adventurous enough, accusing him of ruining her creative ecosystem. The argument escalated until she stormed out, slamming the door so hard the frame rattled. What neither of them expected was how quickly the fallout spread. Denise contacted him later that day with news that her evidence had triggered confrontations in multiple households. One of the men's wives had kicked him out immediately. Another had shown up at the man's workplace and exposed everything to his coworkers. A third had filed a police report after discovering explicit messages between her husband and someone from the group. Within 48 hours, the quiet suburban neighborhood was buzzing with whispers, accusations, and frantic late-night arguments. Parents pulled their children away from certain homes, church groups held emergency meetings, and several marriages hit breaking points almost overnight. Meanwhile, his own wife doubled down on her denial, posting vague social media messages about being persecuted for artistic expression, and insisting her actions were misunderstood performances. She sent him long, rambling texts accusing him of sabotaging her life and threatening to expose him for emotional neglect, though she couldn't provide a single example. He saved every message. He documented every conversation. He prepared for the legal storm he knew was coming. What hurt most wasn't the betrayal itself, but the grotesque certainty that she felt no remorse, no responsibility, no connection to the life they had built together. She had chosen fantasy over reality, lies over marriage, chaos over truth. And he understood now that confronting her had not ended anything. It had only ignited the wildfire that would consume everything connected to room 204. The courthouse hallway felt like a stage he never auditioned for, yet somehow he had become the unwilling protagonist. When his name was called, he stepped inside the courtroom and immediately spotted her, seated at the defendant's table in full medieval cosplay. She wore a velvet cloak, braided hair extensions, and a leather chest piece decorated with painted runes, as if she were attending a fantasy convention instead of a divorce hearing. Gasps rippled through the spectators, and even the judge paused mid-sentence, visibly struggling to process the sight before him. She rose dramatically, bowing toward the bench, announcing that her attire symbolized the artistic realm in which the allegations originated. The judge instructed her firmly to sit down and reminded her this was a legal proceeding, not a theatrical performance. Her attorney looked exhausted, as though he had begged her to dress normally and failed. When the hearing began, her lawyer attempted to argue that the events in room 204 were consensual acts of performance art, conducted within a fictional narrative universe. He described the group's activities as immersive storytelling that transcended traditional boundaries and should not be interpreted through a mundane moral framework. The judge blinked twice, then asked flatly if the lawyer was referring to adultery disguised as a tabletop campaign. The courtroom chuckled, and her attorney wilted in defeat. Witnesses were called next. Denise took the stand first, explaining how she had tracked her husband, documented the schedules, and alerted the husband after realizing the pattern involved more than one spouse. Her voice shook, but her testimony was precise, detailed, and supported by photographs and timestamps. Several spouses of the other men followed, each recounting their own discoveries in painful, embarrassed tones. The pattern became undeniable. Room 204 was not an isolated lapse, but a recurring gathering centered around deception, secrecy, and explicit encounters. When the husband submitted the audio recording, the courtroom fell silent except for the faint clicks of dice, the exaggerated character voices, and the unmistakable sounds of physical acts woven into the narrative. At one point in the recording, his wife could be heard narrating a scene involving binding rituals of flesh and unity, which made the judge abruptly stop the playback and order the clip sealed from public record. The judge's expression had shifted from bewilderment to restrained fury. When it was her turn to speak, she stood confidently, insisting that every action she took was part of a larger creative mission. She claimed she was building an experimental, mythic commune, exploring the intersection of intimacy and fantasy world-building. She argued that the men involved were devotees of her storytelling craft, and that trying to label their sessions as infidelity was a failure to appreciate her artistic vision. The judge asked her a simple question: whether she had engaged in sexual relations with individuals who were not her husband. She tried to launch into a monologue about narrative immersion, but the judge cut her off sharply and demanded a yes or no answer. She said yes. A long, stunned silence followed. Her attorney lowered his head into his hands. From that moment, the outcome was inevitable. The judge declared her behavior unequivocal adultery, dismissed her demands as unreasonable and unsupported, and granted the husband primary property rights and legal protection from any further financial claims. Her expression crumpled, but not with remorse, only disbelief that the world refused to understand her self-proclaimed art. As the gavel struck, the courtroom exhaled collectively, the spectacle finally concluded. For the husband, it wasn't victory. It was closure. A painful, public, surreal closure, but closure nonetheless. In the weeks after the ruling, the chaos that had erupted around room 204 did not fade. It simply mutated into something quieter, heavier, and far more tragic. The 6 men who had taken part in the sessions were suddenly thrust into consequences none of them had anticipated. One lost his job after his employer received an anonymous envelope containing screenshots of his messages and timestamps matching work hours. Another was served divorce papers on his front porch, while his children watched from the doorway, confused and frightened. A third moved into a coworker's basement, ashamed to return home after his wife exposed the affair to their extended family. Their lives fractured in different ways, each ripple tracing back to the motel room where fantasy and betrayal had blended into something destructive. Meanwhile, his ex-wife spiraled in a direction that even he couldn't have predicted. Instead of laying low or attempting to rebuild her life privately, she launched a public crusade to reclaim her narrative. She created a GoFundMe page titled Defending Creative Freedom, complete with dramatic language about censorship and oppression. The fundraiser barely scraped together a handful of donations, most of them anonymous and likely sarcastic. Undeterred, she started recording lengthy video monologues from her living room, still wearing her medieval costumes, speaking to an imaginary kingdom of followers. In these videos, she declared herself the leader of an emerging, mythic society, dedicated to the fusion of storytelling and corporeal expression. The comment sections filled with mockery almost immediately, though a few confused strangers tried to ask if she needed help. She ignored them all, convinced that the world was simply too unenlightened to understand her vision. Within a month, she expanded her efforts into a podcast where she narrated dramatic retellings of the quests from room 204, altering details to paint herself as a misunderstood heroine. Her voice wavered between theatrical confidence and the tremble of someone unraveling. Clips of her episodes began circulating online as memes, each one more surreal than the last. Locals who once knew her as a quiet neighbor now crossed the street to avoid her, whispering about her late-night costume-wearing walks and the flyers she taped to mailboxes promoting her upcoming Kingdom Restoration project. She tried to recruit members for her new society, handing out homemade pamphlets at the library, at grocery store parking lots, even outside the courthouse. No one joined. The more she pushed, the more isolated she became, until her presence felt like a ghost haunting the edges of a community that wanted desperately to move on. For the husband, life finally began to settle into something resembling peace. He moved into a smaller house a few towns over, a place with quiet streets and no lingering memories embedded in the walls. Therapy became a weekly ritual, not out of desperation, but out of the relief of having someone help him piece together the emotional wreckage. He found himself sleeping better, eating better, even laughing at moments he once thought would never feel light again. He began dadding slowly, cautiously, discovering that affection did not have to be theatrical or destructive to feel meaningful. He and Denise, bound first by shared devastation, developed an unexpected friendship marked by honesty, dark humor, and mutual healing. Sometimes they talked about the past, but more often they talked about the future, a future in which room 204 was only a distant, absurd chapter rather than a defining scar. As autumn arrived, he finally felt the weight in his chest lifting. The story that had begun with a stranger's whisper at a bus stop now ended with clarity, closure, and the quiet hope of rebuilding. And though he no longer feared secrets, he held on to one final lesson as he stepped into his new life. If someone ever claimed they were going to a book club, he would always ask, calmly and politely, exactly what book they were reading. He stood on the balcony of his new home, watching the late afternoon light spill across the quiet neighborhood, and for the first time in months, his chest felt light. The chaos, the humiliation, the endless nights replaying every painful detail, all of it finally seemed distant, as if it belonged to someone else's story. He no longer jumped at the sound of phone notifications or felt the weight of dread each Tuesday afternoon. His days unfolded with a calm rhythm, marked by work, therapy sessions, and the slow, steady rebuilding of trust in himself and others. He found comfort in small routines, like morning walks and late-night conversations with Denise, whose presence had become a steady, grounding force in his life. He wasn't rushing into anything new, but he no longer feared the idea of love or connection. What mattered now was clarity, honesty, and the quiet confidence that he could recognize danger long before it reached his doorstep again. As he closed the balcony door and stepped inside, he felt a final sense of closure settle over him. If a stranger ever whispered a warning to him again, he would listen. And if someone ever claimed they were headed to a book club, he would calmly ask which book they were reading.